Hello, good evening. Welcome to Queer Vision 2020. I'm Rebecca. I'm the lead programmer for Queer Vision, the Bristol Pride Film Festival. Tonight we're celebrating our Best of British competition. We have a short list of 10 amazing films that are available on the player if you haven't already seen them. We are about to watch our winning film called Queering Teknolojik by Timothy Smith. And afterwards, we're going to be joined by Tim and some of his collaborators and Dr Edson Burton, who's going to be hosting the conversation afterwards. So please stick around and enjoy the film. Here it is.
I'm Edson Burton. I'm a member of Come the Revolution and Kiki Bristol. Come the Revolution is a black film collective based in Bristol and heavily involved with programming black film in association with Watershed and Southwest Hub. And also I'm a member of Kiki Bristol, a cutie pot collective that has been doing great things in the city recently. Today we're discussing Queering Teknolojik, and I'm being joined in the discussion by the collaborators and filmmakers.
Hi, I'm Timothy Smith. I'm the director of the film, which I've made as part of my PhD research.
Hi, I'm So Meyer. I was one of the collaborators on the film with Tim, and I'm a writer and film curator.
Hi, I'm Valentino. I'm Intersex equality rights campaigner in the UK, and I work largely in arts and culture in various forms. And I was delighted to collaborate with Tim and Campbell on this fantastic film.
I wonder if I could start by asking Tim to describe this film. If an audience hadn't heard about this film, just read a bit of a blurb, it's quite experimental. Could you tell us, how would you describe the film?
Well, primarily it's a message from the future, and it's a message of hope. When So and I were in early discussions about collaborating on this project, I was very excited when So suggested that we make a utopian film rather than I was kind of toying with the idea of a dystopian film. But So was kind of only interested in collaborating if it was a utopian project, which kind of sent me down a very exciting path. But yeah, it's primarily a vision of a kind of queer utopian future, and describes the path of how we got there by looking back at the past from the perspective of the queer kind of utopian communities that are sending us this message.
How was this journey of collaboration, and how did it begin? How did it gestate?
So and I started discussions around in May. So in May 2018 to kind of October of the same year, we had quite a lot of discussions, and I went away and read a lot. So recommended this really amazing anthology of visionary fiction called Octavia's Brood, which is edited by Walida Imarisha and Adria Marie Brown. And then that sent me down rabbit holes, reading a lot of works by some of the other authors in this anthology. It just kind of started this thinking process of a different kind of future based on, because a lot of the writers in this anthology are also social justice activists, and so a lot of it is grounded in kind of this grassroots activism, and a majority queer women of colour, and it just really informed a lot of the ideas that kind of found themselves in the script. And then we invited Valentino and Campbell and our other collaborator Teresa on board. Started those discussions in November, but Christmas got in the way. We finally met up in January 2019, sat around the dinner table, had some food and discussion, and then we created this collective digital voice. I'd used this digital voice software for my previous project, a PhD film, using just my own voice. But for this project, I really wanted to kind of queer the machine, to kind of subvert the expectation that the AI algorithm required only one voice. The software needs you to read up to you can read up to 300 sentences, and it creates a vocal avatar. of these voice recordings. And so we took turns reading the sentences that the AI offered us, which were hilarious in themselves, quite gendered and weirdly specific. But we created our collective digital voice, and then we had a very detailed discussion about what we wanted the voice to say. And it was very important for me in the subsequent script writing process that I incorporate everybody's viewpoints and beliefs of what a utopian future would look like for them. And so there was a lot of back and forth about that.
It really was exactly the way that Tim described it. It started as a conversation. I think it arose quite organically out of a shared love of science fiction and the BFI's Big Days of Fear and Wonder program, and some of the gaps or lacks in that program, our excitement about the Afrofuturist strand, which was curated by Ashley Clark, and our beloved Born in Flames, directed by Lizzie Borden. And a conversation about why there weren't more films like that, about the nitty-gritty of how that film was made in a very collective, organic, grabbing material when it could be grabbed on the streets using archive footage way. So it really arose out of a love of films, a question about the gap in cinema. Why did cinema find it so hard to address or respond to the brilliant Afrofuturist writing? Why has there never been an adaptation of Octavia Butler would be one way of phrasing that question, although it doesn't capture the whole spectrum. Why has there never been a good film adaptation of Ursula Le Guin? All of this cultural material that hadn't made it onto the screen or only made it into very experimental films like Dandy Dust, and we wanted to acknowledge that tradition first in our conversations as film fans, as programmers, and it was so exciting watching how that unfolded in Tim's conception for this film and finding a form that met its narrative and met its purpose. So identifying how to make a collective voice in a film using this new technology, which is meant to be, as Tim said, used to produce a single voice, subverting it, queering it to produce a voice that doesn't speak in expected or received ways, and echoes with all sorts of different histories and backgrounds. And sitting around that table, a kitchen table collective, another great history in feminist and particularly women of culture production, like over food that Tim prepared for us, and sharing our voices, sharing laughter. I think you can hear that in the film, that it comes from this very warm place. And it was amazing to make something that just gave us the opportunity to speak back to ourselves with love. As Tim said, it's not dystopian, it's not a warning, it's not punishment, it's saying that the future recognizes us and our potential. And right now, I think it's actually giving me chills as I say it. Right now, we need to hear that more than ever.
So in some ways, the actual process of making the film is the future thing that you're suggesting.
Yeah, we're totally making one short film created a queer, intersectional, anti-racist future. But I think we all believe that all of the work that we do collectively can add to that. I don't know, Valentino, like your work is so much about doing that from every angle and every aspect. It's not one thing that's going to make the future.
Yeah, I absolutely grew up finding life in science fiction and in reading science fiction, because I grew up. I was born in the 60s, surprisingly, and my father was a person of colour. My mother was white, but we didn't grow up with her. We just grew up with my dad, and he was an immigrant to this country, and it was the 70s and 80s were a tough time to be a kid, a mixed race kid, kind of trying to find my way and trying to find a space where I could exist, and also being intersex and not really understanding, because not having any language either for any of these things. So science fiction just gave me life, really, and it was always a space where I could envision possibilities, even though I didn't actually see myself there. It seemed like a space where I might be able to exist. And I always interpreted it as something, in some ways, championing championing the possibility of existence in queer ways, you know, as well as being a lesbian. And there were just so many things that were, and being working class immigrants, so we didn't quite fit. And my dad saying, just speak really good English. Don't, you know, that was my one thing that I had where I could have a good accent, because we didn't have much else that we could I could launch myself into the world with. So finding my way to activism and feeling empowered always has been through film, through science fiction. And when we came together and Tim asked us, you know, invited us to join with him, that sense, I guess, also of working as a collective felt really nurturing and empowering and inclusive. I've often felt excluded from spaces, and often have been over the years, because it's hard to fit. You know, especially, you know, with intersex variation as well. And yeah, it has been hard to fit. And so feeling part of something's been really moving as well. And I think the goodwill that we brought as we came together really made a difference to the piece. I think you can feel the compassion in the piece, and you can feel the hope and the goodwill. And I always feel moved when I watch it. It always brings actually a bit of a tear to my eye, because it's so the idea of us, you know, coming back. I mean, our future selves coming back to us and going, "Don't give up," you know. And I love the line, "Please become us." It's so beautiful. It's like, please go in this way to something, you know, where we can be a collective, where we can have a future that seeks to bring us together and nurture us.
This is science fiction geek thinking, and I'm an Afrofuturist fan and so on. But I was left with the question: is the future that's posited in the film happening? Is that message coming back? Or is it dependent upon us actually following the paths that have been suggested? So this future will happen if, in a sense, we follow the very processes and paths that are being described in the film. So the future is not set, but it could be if we follow this trajectory.
That's very much why there's a line that your kind of future is being determined with every respiration you take. Like the future, different futures are becoming possible and impossible. Your possibilities and impossibilities are changing with every respiration you take. So it really is just this call to be vigilant, that we can't be complacent. We can't not take to the streets. We can't just hope that goodness is going to happen. We have to continue to take action and do something about it. Yeah, especially even more so now than when we made the film, I think.
Being present is always something I've talked about in my activism, and it being actually showing up, being there with and protesting, being visible, being seen, and that's become something very complex now. But that's always been an important part of pushing for change, is being seen to be part of a protest, being there.
So, Tim, you mentioned that it was So Meyer's intervention that kind of encouraged you not to go down the dystopia route. What was that initial pull towards dystopia, and why was it important as a collaborative team that you decided not to go down that angle?
I wanted to make a film about social justice, and in my mind at the time, without the valuable input from everyone else, especially I was thinking that it's kind of making a dystopian film, critiquing the kind of the dystopian reality that we're living in, was one way of me doing that. The other important aspect, and why ethically this needed to be a collaborative work, was as a white cisgendered man, I didn't think it was responsible for me to be tackling a lot of these issues that inevitably involve people of color and women. I wouldn't be able to ethically make this film on my own. So that's another reason why it was important to collaborate with a diverse group of individuals who also happen to be longtime friends.
So I'm very influenced by the work of Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, who I mentioned, and the ways that they think about utopia and dystopia, which are distinct from each other, but neither of them would ever say that what they wrote was entirely a dystopia or entirely a utopia. So even in Butler's hardest hitting books, The Parable of the Talents and The Parable of the Sower, which were being talked about quite a lot in 2016, 2017, around the time of the last US election, which is unbelievably only 4 years ago, and fell between Days of Fear and Wonder and starting to talk about this film. It's the most dystopian imagining possible, one that is rooted in the genocidal colonial history of the Americas. But what emerges out of it is a practice of change, the Earthseed practice, that is about collaboration, about a collective that builds hope together in an almost impossible condition. And that's something I think we see very rarely reflected in cinema. It's either a high stakes threat that is unimaginable, it's extragalactic in a Marvel film, and a small band of extra superheroes who are not accessible to us as humans band together and prevent it. Or lots of people made the critique of the adaptation of Handmaid's Tale that it was representing many things that had happened in the US that had been done by settler culture in the US to indigenous people, to Black people who were enslaved, with a butter would never melt, this couldn't happen here attitude. So dystopias are imagined that have historically occurred as if they hadn't, and often displaced onto white, conventionally attractive, cisgendered bodies. And I felt very wary of that. There's something that Adrienne Maree Brown and Walida Marusha also talk about in their work, that dystopian imagining, recognizing the present for its dystopian qualities is important, and recognizing solutions that might come out of that we may just call utopian because they're better than what we have now rather than perfect, was equally important. So not getting into a spiral of impossibility, but finding a way up from the bottom. And the film actually does both of those things, because it talks back to the present and it says, recognize that where you are now, you can't just accept this status quo. It's hurting so many people. It's not good enough. It is a dystopia, even if it's not in your personal life because of your privilege. It is a dystopia. And there is a way out of it. And as you said, Edson, it's not a fixed way out. It's not like there's only one route. The film offers ideas, possibilities that anyone can take up. And I think of it as being a bit like a delta going to the sea. Like there's many, many different streams that could get to that possible future. Or, literally with climate change, that future could just dry up.
It's really interesting to hear the kind of the journey of this film, because obviously it landed with us at Queer Vision. When we watched it, obviously the pandemic had already started. Everything felt so much at the forefront in terms of a focus on the climate emergency, and then Black Lives Matters coming to the fore. And then we watched this film, which just felt like it was speaking, it just felt so much of the time. It felt like you maybe made it like the week before. You're talking about the way that it was made and the hope and the compassion. I think like we really felt that as kind of viewers and watching it, which is, and I think why we ended up picking the film as our winner. So I think it's always really nice to know, because I think when you're making something, you have hopes for it, and you know what your intentions, and then how it's received when you put it out there is also like you kind of. Yeah, you don't know what journey it's going to take after that. Yeah, I just wanted to reflect that back, and I guess also pick up on in the film, I think it talks about the three-pronged approach, and I think that felt so. I think during this time, obviously everyone has had very different lived experiences, and is coming from different positions of privilege and how that's impacted them. But I think it in some ways it has really forced kind of this reflection and this interconnectivity between those things. I just wondered if you could speak to that a bit.
I think it was also around the same time, because I found myself during the editing process resisting the temptation to use Extinction Rebellion climate change protest footage, because they've been so heavily criticized for their lack of diversity and their lack of consideration of people of color in the conversation who were doing very, very similar work, not being included in that planning. And also this very privileged kind of message of deliberately get yourself arrested, which is obviously very traumatic for a lot of people of color. And so there was something that was very much in my mind, but also the fact that these three prongs of the approach are inextricably linked. They can't be separated. We can't think about climate change and tackling environmental issues without tackling capitalism and other issues of deprivation and socioeconomic issues. So it is this kind of, we have to take a decolonial, environmental and anti-capitalist approach if we're going to get anywhere close to any of the possible futures that people might consider close to utopian or better than what we have now.
Thinking about technology, and I always call it neoliberalism, the economic system. I know some people call it capitalism, but I think of the neoliberalism, the overarching neoliberalism economic model, which really is driving all of these things. And I think it's the coming, from the future back and looking at this and saying, well, how do you drive change and keep technology? Obviously, now technology is driven through neoliberalist agendas which don't serve us or our activisms whatsoever. However, if we took out the neoliberalism and we used another intention to drive technology, one of community, one of need, and one of kind of collective activisms, and which support us, then of course technology becomes less oppressive and something that's joyful. Because it enables. At the moment, it certainly doesn't feel like that. And I know when we came together and were having the conversations which created this, which collectively kind of created a lot of our visions, I was feeling very frustrated about, as an activist intersectionally, where I homelessness is very important to me because we were homeless during my childhood. And it's something that I was working together. I've done, always try to be inclusive with the Outside Project, a homelessness project for LGBTIQ plus people based in London. And so sort of working, also trying to include, or in my activism, also making sure I platform the voices of asylum seekers, the voices of people, with uncertain status, and intersex rights. I do feel still like sometimes we're situated, those of us in that group are kind of situated as the abject, and we have no place in the productivity of kind of a neoliberalist agenda. And I don't think we ever will unless we come together collectively as activists and as with compassion and say, let's all of us come up together. And it just, with the kind of liking mentality where you just like something on the internet, you just like something in a social media space, that doesn't support my activism. That doesn't change the Home Office. It doesn't do, for me, it's frustrating. It doesn't do anything. And so we talked a lot about showing presence, about showing people, turning up with banners, with messages, coming together. That feeling that we're people with power and can make change, which is really lost in social media spaces where you get trolled, where algorithms actively silence us, and where, frankly, I try not to spend too much time there because I don't feel safe. So I really felt like the film spoke to those frustrations and those conversations we were having.
The film is called Queering the Teknolojik, and I feel that in some ways that is a shout out, a homage to disability activism and a long tradition of cripping technology as well, of taking technology that supposedly creates access but actively obstructs it or only presents it to certain kinds of people, thus creating more social exclusions, and hacking it so that many kinds of bodies, voices, selves, minds can use it anti-productively, I guess, creatively, generatively, as those bodies and minds wish to. So in changing and challenging the voice recorder and making it a synthesizer that could, despite its desires, we made it produce a collective voice that challenged standard English, standard enunciation, standard pronunciation, in having subtitles on the film as a commitment, creating a sense there are bodies, this range of bodies that you see in the archive footage, but there are also these voices that, and you don't know what bodies they belong to. They could be bodies that aren't able to access being in the street. They could be bodies that are configured in ways that we haven't even thought about or encompassed yet, or that disability activists are thinking about and encompassing. So that was exciting for me as well, to think about film as this space that can represent bodies in the street and the necessity of activism on the line, but also activisms that take place in other ways, through imagining, through supporting, through giving voice to, through holding the memory of. And as Valentino says, what if we took control of technology as a tool to make it something that engaged with us and with the futures we want to generate, rather than giving our data to deeply sinister companies like Zoom, which we're currently on.
Well, it's a horrible irony, isn't it, that it's very difficult to escape. But on that score, I've got to say that so much of the film resonated with my values as an Afrofuturist, that in particular, that sometimes when one is involved in different activist movements, one can be caught in the binary nature of the struggle, but never posit what we're trying to get to. And it's wonderful to see that kind of positing of the thing that we are trying to achieve, and to see that realized. With that in mind, I mean, bearing in mind, at this current moment in time, we can see how social media and the online world is being used, and it is not friendly to us. But in your own activism, and Timothy, I would call this project a work of activism as well. Do you see that this decolonization, this other possibility of the internet in terms of bringing together the online world, even, of bringing together activisms to create the kind of future, do you see the germination of this happening in your personal activisms?
My personal activisms, yeah, and because I'm also very lucky to be involved and have many queer friends who do amazing work in different parts of the community. So I guess I am lucky enough to see that. I don't know if it's as widespread as it needs to be to enact significant change yet, but hopefully, as you say, like it's the germ of it's germinating in some way, hopefully growing, and hopefully it'll grow faster than it currently is. I don't know, I'm trying to be optimistic. It's difficult at the moment with maybe after November in the US election, I might be a little bit more optimistic.
I'm naturally an optimist for some reason, which is quite surprising when I look back at my life experiences, but that's carried me through, and I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because it's amazing, that when Tim approached me, and Tim's a fantastic friend of mine anyway, but when Tim approached me and, described the practice, the collaborative practice, and his intention for the film, I find that so enheartening, so if that's a word, so important, because I often felt, so often in my life, I felt that people make the kind of assumptions, they gain position, especially from middle class spaces where they are, perhaps not from immigrant spaces, they really feel that they belong in the country they're in, perhaps, and they've got certain privilege. And there are so many assumptions made about what we must be able to do, what we could manage. And often, there are so many people who, not to sort of start throwing mud at people and talk about hypocrites, but so many people talk about collective work, they talk about collaboration, but they are always going to be the star of it. That's always the intention. The number of times I've given so much emotional labour and thought I was collaborating, but I wasn't actually. I was just being a platform for someone to walk on, to rise up. And it's so common, and that would happen. And, I don't know what was different with Tim, so different with Tim and the other collaborators, is this sense that where there is privilege, it's used with generosity to lift us all up. And there's been an honesty and an integrity through the entire project that is essential to those of us, especially who come from underprivileged backgrounds, who come from disadvantage, and who don't have necessarily a knowledge of how things might work, and so wouldn't get to have these platforms to speak. I certainly come from that kind of background where things were a lot of struggle. And I know I sort of live my best life and wear a nice shirt, but the truth is it's been very hard because there are walls everywhere to do with class, to do with, privilege, to do with money, so many walls that I've come across in my life. And so this has meant a lot for that. And I feel optimistic because if we get this example out there and we see more examples of people working like this, we are going to create empowerment, and we are going to get so much more out. The voices that have experiences that are less common or less known will be heard, and it does matter. And I think that is one of the reasons as well why this feels so now. This film feels so current and so expressive of many of our feelings now, because it's doing this, and we feel so much that we need this at the moment. So many of us feel silenced or without as much hope, as we need, or without that encouraging voice.
Given that the film itself is fantastic, and I will consume and look at it again and again, but the process of making seems so vital. How much of that have you documented or recorded, or how much have you talked about that as collaborators?
I feel like Valentino said, I mostly documented the process of this in my body. That I do a lot of collective work online. So I'm part of a campaigning group called Raising Films for parents and carers in the film industry, and we're dispersed across the UK, and we now have a chapter in Australia and a chapter in Ireland. So a lot of our work is via Skype, online document sharing, things like that, and those are very powerful tools. But I know how it feels when we're in a room together, and the gestural language, the awareness of each other's breath, of the variety of our bodies and our presences, that's not something that can be documented even in a photograph or written down. It is, as Tim says, it's in the work itself, and that is something that is really precious to me about this film. We did work online collectively and asynchronously as well, particularly on the script, which went back and forth in email drafts with rafts of comments and feedback, and that was very rich and chewy, but I could feel connected to it because I was aware of having sat next to and across of and shared food with people. And especially now, that seems like such an incredible privilege to have been able to do that, to be in that room together. And I sort of hope that it gives audiences, wherever they're watching, the chance to connect with themselves and their memories of that in their body, those moments. It's not so much documenting our process as for viewers to recognize, oh yeah, I know how to do that. I know how to be with others, or even one other, and for something, a line or a joke or a look to come out of that, and it moves you into the future. Because sometimes it's that tiny, we didn't sit together around the table and we were like, right, here's our whiteboard, our strategic plan for the future. It was jokes, it was responses to these ridiculously gendered instructions that the computer issued to us, and thinking about how we subvert them, bringing our lived history of subverting the social computer that we all confront in different ways and different embodiments every day.
Yeah, and I think so, that's you're so articulate, so that's so wonderful. When you hear the film, the feelings of moments of constant translation, of a kind of searching back into the past, which is for us now, and feeling this constant translation of intention and of meaning, but with a thread of integrity, with a thread that can pull us forward to a future of safety, perhaps a future, where we can feel that we can be. That feeling of these little translations of the way the language work is an enactment really of that process where, of our conveying to each other the wishes and intentions we had for the meanings in the film. And as well as that, it was, I cannot say enough how gendered this machine was. That and it was, it reminded me of the first time I heard about Sims, that computer game, and I thought, oh, I'll make a society that isn't neoliberalist. And of course you can't. It's all about, you can only do it within those parameters. But we really did queer this technology because, first of all, from my perspective, I was born with an intersex variation. I am physically not, I'm not wholly situated in what the computer that voice computer wanted it to be. So the minute we started recording my physical voice, we were recording the voice of a person, who's part of a physical variation of what that insisted upon. And it felt radical. Those moments when we were recording our voices, they felt radical to me, simply because of our presence, but also the machine then did translate. We did become this collective voice, and then the layering that Tim, really intelligently and just with a really important lightness of touch as well, the way Tim constructed the film, it really did pick out the kind of malleability, the fluidity, and the potential of change in different moments. We've all felt it when we see the film, the visuals, the sound, the way everything interconnected, and our sense of the process of it really did sort of play out and tease out those threads, I think.
Because you all described this film with so much love, one of my frustrations as a one-time, erstwhile perhaps, academic is that these possibilities, that work, which is both fantastic in process but also in outcome, it's sometimes how are they more widely dispersed? Because what you've done, I think, wonderfully is, and Valentino, you talked about sometimes the illusionary nature of collaboration, and dare I also add co-creation. But what I felt was happening in your process as collaborators is a real displacement of voice, and that the actual mechanics of creating an artificial voice is about displacing in voice, also about ego, a singular ego. And I feel that in terms of if we're looking at activism or even looking at communities and looking at leaderships, it provides a model, a way potentially of social practice, not just in activism, but wider. Hence, I guess I was kind of thinking, maybe this film is the document. Our conversation is part of the documentation process. But it feels like that's a really important way of us getting to the utopia that you're describing as well.
And now you, Edson and Rebecca, and also John, who is behind the technology, are part of that conversation as well. Your voice is part of the blend of how this film is travelling to the future. And I'm excited about that any viewer watching it can add their voice to it by describing it to someone else. It's not a limited process, which I think sometimes co-creation or collaboration are very much about the in-group as well as the ego. So creating open collaborations, and I think Tim and I talked a lot about what we'd experienced at Occupy London and about the open structure of Black Lives Matter that has people who lead in moments on the ground, but is a collective organisation, and the history of that in feminist organising at places like Greenham as well. It's a thread that goes through some of the most inspiring, even though the media tries to single out this figurehead or that figurehead, it is collective work, and it's sort of a secret thread through history. So it's an acknowledgement of our connection to that as well. And maybe the only way to make the future is to keep acknowledging that what we're doing isn't, we might be using a new technology, but it's not new. It's always homage and recognition of great legacies.
I guess we're probably up to time. All I can say is thank you, panelists, for really what's been an inspiring, absolutely inspiring conversation with you all. I'm going to enjoy the film, but this has been a really special time. Querying...
Should we all say it together?
Let's say it all together, sorry. 1, 2, 3. Querying the technology. Thank you all.
Thanks, Edson.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, John.
That was great. Thanks so much to Edson for hosting. Thanks for Tim, and Valentino for joining us for an amazing discussion. We'd really love to know what you think, so follow us on Twitter at Queer Vision Film. We'll also be posting more upcoming events over the next 3 weeks. The whole of the shortlist is available to watch until the 11th of October, and also our selection of the Best of Iris 2019. So be sure to check that out as well. I'd just like to take this moment to say a really big thank you to the Queer Vision team and Bristol Pride, and of course to Encounters for hosting us, and our festival sponsor, Triodos Bank. We couldn't do it without you, so big thank you, and thanks everyone for coming, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. We'll see you again soon.